Hello, I am Eddie O'Sullivan, and this is This Week in the Second World War. In This Week in the Second World War, brought to you by the International Second World War History Network. In 1940, on the 12th of March, the Moscow Peace Treaty ending the Winter War between Finland and the Soviet Union is signed. In 1941, on the 9th of March, a German aircraft bomb London and damage Buckingham Palace. On the 10th of March, Japanese Rear Admiral Takejiro Onishi gives Osoruku Yamamoto a draft of the Pearl Harbor attack plan. On the 11th of March, President Roosevelt enacts the Lend-Lease Act. Vichy France and Thailand agree a treaty in which Thailand regains territory west of the Mekong River, and on the 12th of March, President Roosevelt asks Congress for $7 billion in Lend-Lease aid. In 1942, on the 9th of March, the Dutch East Indies campaign ends in a Japanese victory. Japan begins the invasion of Buka and Bougainville in the South Pacific. On the 11th of March, Douglas MacArthur's escape from the Philippines begins, and on the 12th of March, the Battle of Java ends in Japanese victory. In 1943, on the 10th of March, Germany announces the rationing of its non-essential goods and restricts telephone use and photography. On the 12th of March, the Soviet Fifth Army captures Vyazma. On the 13th of March, Henning von Tresckow attempts to assassinate Adolf Hitler by arranging for a bomb-laden parcel to be placed aboard Hitler's plane. The liquidation of the Krakow ghetto is completed, and on the 15th of March, the Third Battle of Kharkov ends in German victory. In 1944, on the 9th of March, the US 5th Marine Regiment takes Talisea in New Britain. On the 11th of March, British forces took Buthidaung in Burma. Eberhard von Breitenbuch takes a concealed pistol to a military briefing with Hitler at the Berghof with the intention of assassinating him. On the 12th of March, US Marines occupy Vodje Atoll without opposition. Soviet forces cross the Bug River at Gavorone. Hitler orders the occupation of Hungary, and on the 13th of March, the Soviet 28th Army captures Kherson. Right, now I'm going to bring in Joe Quinn, who is my regular guest. Hello, Joe. How are you doing?
Good. How are you doing this evening, Eddie?
Very good. Thank you very much. And some dates there. I mentioned Henning von Tresckow. Any dates there that attracted your attention?
Well, of course, you have the Third Battle of Kharkov, which ends in Soviet victory. So you have, and that's happening around the same week. So what happens really is you have Kharkov changes hands 3 times throughout the course of the war. So the Soviets initially take it, the Germans push them back. There's the so that's the Second Battle of Kharkov, and then the Soviets make another. So they overextend themselves, and the Soviets are basically at this particular point they're pushing. This is following the Battle of Kursk, and so Kharkov and Kursk are not too far away. So it's following a Soviet victory. They're getting used to sort of being on the offensive. So they're not exactly getting everything right. And also the Germans are considerably strong around Kharkov, and they understand that it's a very key position. So they push them out, reoccupy the city. And the destruction of Kharkov, the wartime destruction of Kharkov, principally takes place during the Third Battle, because the Germans had blasted their way in from one side. And then essentially the Soviets come in, they basically lay down pre-bombardment Katyusha rockets, heavy artillery, and then basically they go in and they blast their way in with tanks, with infantry support. And they didn't have as much of this in the first. So when they first took Kharkiv, they essentially, it was just basically, they were just grabbing what they could, because the Germans were retreating at this particular point. So Hitler ordered Kharkiv to be retaken. It was taken, and then basically the Germans got pushed out street by street. It was a bloody battle, and the taking of Kharkiv is considered to be, Kharkiv is seen to be a very symbolic city. It wasn't the first time that the Soviets had attempted to retake the city, and it's part of a wider strategy to basically move into Ukraine and to drive a wedge between German forces and move towards retaking Ukraine and Belarus. So it's a key strategic objective. It's going to take the Russians a lot of time to get into a position where they can fully retake the Soviet territories in the west, Belarus and Ukraine, and involves quite a lot of river crossings at this particular point. So this is something that they'll have to build towards, but the taking of Kharkiv is a very promising first step to the reconquest of Soviet territory. Now, in that particular same week, you have Henning von Tresckow and a number of other German generals who are based with the German army in what is then still considered to be Soviet Russia, being visited at an airfield not far from the front by Hitler himself. So he flies in. This is the last time Hitler will ever set foot on Soviet territory. So he flies in and basically sits down to have a conference and sort of lunch with his generals at an airfield near, I'm just trying to remember the city. It's the last city that the Germans will hold before Smolensk. It was near Smolensk. And it was an airfield just outside Smolensk. I believe it was the same airfield where half the Polish government were killed when they flew to the Katyn Memorial back in 2009. Very tragic air disaster which killed essentially the elite of the Polish military and half the Polish government on a military flight. So it's the same airfield, same airport. And at that airport, essentially, after the conference, Hitler boards his plane to fly back to Berlin. But the problem is that Henning von Tresckow has placed a bomb. He's had a bomb placed on the aircraft while Hitler was on the ground. And the plane takes off. They expect it to detonate. It's the 5th attempted assassination, I believe, on Hitler's life, 4th or 5th. And what they believe happened was the plane reached a particular altitude. It was still spring of 43. And the temperatures were quite cold up there. And they believe that the time pencil or the particular trigger device froze and didn't detonate. There was a problem with the detonator. And so the device didn't go off. If it had gone off, it would have fatally damaged the aircraft, possibly killed the occupants in the cabin. And then probably you would have had Hermann Göring or somebody else taking over as Führer of the Third Reich. But that didn't happen. And this failed attempt to blow up Hitler's plane is recounted in the movie Valkyrie. It's at the beginning of the movie, Eddie, where you have Henning von Tresckow, a leading German general, one of the best they have in the Eastern Front, being played by Kenneth Branagh.
Exactly. I think it's a really good film. Very well done. And a lot of people in Germany weren't very keen on Tom Cruise doing it, but in the end, I think he did a pretty good job on it. And of course, Stauffenberg, he suffered his major injuries in Tunisia when my dad was there. Although he was fighting the 8th Army, my dad was in the 1st Army on the west of Tunisia. Anyway, now we're going to move on, and I'm going to bring on our guest this week, and that's Mr. Michael Keegan. Hello, Michael.
Hello, good evening, Joe and Eddie.
Yeah, great, Michael. So where are you now?
So I'm in London, which is I'm lucky enough to have a flat in London and a house in Petworth. So it's a London week this week.
Okay, very good. So, Michael, you're going to be talking through the story of Admiral Sir Roger Keyes, which is an amazing, astonishing story, really. I mean, anyway, I'll leave you to tell it. But you're doing a PhD, which is almost finished now on this topic. But you're
You did something else before you started tackling it. You were in business for many years, I believe.
Yes, yes. So I spent a 35-year career in business, Eddie. First off in banking, then a bit in private equity, and latterly in technology. And in 2018, I got the opportunity to step off the corporate ladder, and I became actually a defence advisor to the Ministry of Defence for 4.5 years. And at the same time, I decided to indulge my real love, which is the same as you two guys, which is, the First and Second World War history. And I did a master's at King's College London War Studies Department. And it was during that period that I came across Admiral Sir Roger Keyes, who I didn't really know his story. And having sort of read voraciously my entire life about the First and Second World Wars, I was kind of amazed by what I found. And in the end, I turned him into my doctoral thesis.
Right. So there was you had been advised of the Ministry of Defence, so they gave you a connection. Do you have a prejudice towards one of the services? I think inevitably anybody who's got an interest in that period. I mean, I'm an army person. My dad was.
Right. Yes. So I think, I would have to say, I guess, having done a PhD on Keyes and naval heroism, that I'm sort of drawn towards the Royal Navy and the naval domain.
Well, that's good for you. I have to keep my feet on the ground. I suffer terribly from motion sickness.
So, what are you, Joe?
Air Force.
You're a bomber, right? Well, look, so we're perfectly represented on this plan.
Well, I've always been partial to the RAF. Although I'm sort of if I had in another life embarked upon a military career and had a second choice, probably the Irish Guards. But there you go, right. In that order.
Well, good for you. At least you're tall enough, Joe, to be in the Irish Guards, which I am not. And my experience on boats is just terrible. I just cannot get on a boat. I just can't even look at one. And I had a couple of opportunities to flying military helicopters, and that put me off anything to do with the air as well. So I think I was really made for the Napoleonic Wars, Nothing to do with trucks or planes or boats or anything like that. I just couldn't make it. Anyway, look, Michael, you're going to tell the story, so I'll put your slides up, and I think you can go through it all, and then we'll have questions at the end. Just do the presentation. So
sure.
And I'll go through the slides. Just tell me when you want me to.
Okay. I'll tell you when. So I sort of approached this by looking at Roger Keyes in the Second World War, and that was interesting to me because. Roger Keyes is actually not famous for the Second World War. He's famous for the First World War. And what people don't often realize is that he actually made some very significant interventions in the Second World War, and one of very few people to actually, see a lot of active service in both world wars. And I've called the presentation Too Old and Too Bold, which I think is pretty much how he was perceived in the Second World War. And as we shall discover, he caused a great deal of resentment, although I think somewhat has been unfairly judged in history. So that's the first slide. So we can move on, Eddie. So I think the question is, who the hell was he? Well, he's a naval hero of the First World War. He's probably, I would say, almost Britain's biggest hero from the First World War. To sort of reprise his career up until the end of the First World War, he's in the Naval Brigade during the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, and he's one of the first officers. In fact, he's the first officer who actually scales the walls of Peking and frees the diplomatic missions with the Union Jack clutched between his teeth in 1900, which gets him noticed as a very brave naval officer. When war breaks out, he's head of the submarine service in the First World War, and he is one of the people who designs and implements the E-class submarine, which is a very offensive long-range submarine weapon. He's the instigator and the planner, along with his pal Reginald Tyrwhitt, of the Battle of Heligoland Bight on the 28th of August 1914, which is the first British naval victory of the First World War. And 3 German cruisers are sunk. And he's the chief of the naval staff during the entire Dardanelles operation in 1915. which is, an amazing amphibious operation. He remains of the view to the end of his life that the Dardanelles could have and should have been won by the Allied forces, and that if only they'd had another go after the 18th of March 1915, they would have broken through. But what he becomes world famous for is the Zeebrugge and Ostend raids of April and May 1918, which are a response to the increased losses suffered in the English Channel in terms of the U-boat offensive when it's resumed in 1917. And Keyes leads these raids to try and block up the Zeebrugge and Ostend canals, because that is how the U-boats are getting access from the naval base at Bruges into the English Channel. And this is a highly contested piece of First World War history, and it may well be that some people want to ask questions about this. But I would say that Keyes was successful at Zeebrugge, but he failed at Ostend. But whatever your view on whether he was successful or not, during this raid, because of the levels of bravery that are demonstrated, 11 Victoria Crosses are awarded. And I think I'm right in saying that along with Rorke's Drift, that represents the most that have ever been given for a British military engagement. So in total, between all the raids, 11 Victoria Crosses awarded. Keyes doesn't get one of those because he's a senior vice admiral at the time. He's knighted, but he becomes not just Britain's hero, but he becomes world famous as a result. And he progresses in the post-war period as the hero of the Royal Navy up into becoming an admiral of the fleet in 1930. But he's passed over for the position of First Sea Lord because the then Labour government, elected in 1929, does not want to have a fighting admiral as head of the Royal Navy. It wants to enter into a disarmament agreement called the London Naval Treaty, and they think Keyes will be the last person who will agree to this. So they pass over him, and he decides to get his own back on the lot of them because he then stands for Parliament, and he's elected a member of Parliament in February 1934. And his friend is Winston Churchill. And during the 1930s, I've called him the Cassandra of appeasement. Now, if you know your Greek history, you'll know that Cassandra is one of the children of the Greek gods who is forever prophesying the future, but her prophecies are never believed. And I thought that was an appropriate way of describing Roger Keyes during the 1930s, because he is the Cassandra of appeasement as a policy. And what we often forget today is appeasement in the 1930s was a policy supported by all British political parties. It was the policy of the ruling Conservative-led coalition with the Liberals and with elements of Labour called National Labour. And if you stood against appeasement as a policy, you were standing against any chances of political progress. You would never become a minister. You would be shunned. You were like a parliamentary leper. And Keyes is absolutely an opponent of appeasement from the moment he's elected to the House of Commons. And if you read his speeches, he's warning all the time about the dangers of German rearmament, what Hitler means, what Goebbels means for the prospects of peace, and the danger of the development of German pocket battleships if they get onto British trade routes. And he's urging all the time for the Chamberlain-led government, the Baldwin-led government to have Churchill back as a minister for defence coordination. And at this time, which in Churchill's sort of historiography are called his wilderness years, there are very few members of Parliament who will stand with Churchill during this time. And Roger Keyes is probably the most famous of them. Although, interestingly, today, he's almost completely forgotten as a figure during this period. And he's calling for things like national service to be reintroduced. When the Munich Treaty is agreed in October 1938 and comes before the House of Commons for a vote, Keyes and Churchill defy the three-line whip to vote in favour of the Munich Treaty, and they pointedly sit on their hands when the division is called, and they abstain. So there are literally very few MPs who will do this. because, you know, the Munich Treaty represents the high watermark of appeasement. Chamberlain gets something like 20,000 letters of congratulations for having conducted and got a successful outcome to the Munich Treaty, but Roger Keyes will not support it, and neither will Churchill. And in August 1939, Keyes is speaking in Parliament about the dangers posed by a resurgent Japan, a military-led Japan, and the danger this proves to the British Empire in the Asia-Pacific theatre. And just like Churchill, all of his warnings during this period of his life are completely ignored. So his story in the Second World War is he's desperate to get back into the action. He says in Parliament that, you know, he was perceived to be not senior enough in the First World War, and now he feels, aged 68 in 1940, that he's too old to give service in the Second World War. However, he's restored to the active list of admirals in March 1940, and he's warning in April, when the Germans invade Norway, that the most important thing that we need to do in the Norway campaign is to seize the naval port of Trondheim. And he goes to the Admiralty and he develops a detailed plan in Portsmouth for seizing the naval port of Trondheim. And this is very seriously entertained by Churchill, who at the time is First Lord of the Admiralty, and Keyes offers to lead the operation himself. Now, the British operation in Norway, which Chamberlain and Halifax had rejected Churchill's original plan to go into Norway a long time before the Germans invaded on the 9th of April. And Keyes is offering to lead the assault himself. And the British plan is to land the army at a place called Namsos, and for the army to march down and then seize the naval port of Trondheim, and for the Royal Navy to lead an assault and seize Trondheim to help the army actually secure that area. So that is the official British plan. But the problem is that the Navy has changed its mind, and they decide actually they're going to prioritize Narvik and not Trondheim, and they have not told the British Army, which is led by General Carleton de Wyatt, that they've called off their plan to seize the port of Trondheim. So this leads to an absolutely farcical position where General Carleton de Wyatt leads the British troops down towards the port of Trondheim, but he finds that Trondheim is actually in the possession of the Germans. And not only that, but that the Germans in possession of Trondheim have used their destroyers to land troops behind Carleton de Wyatt and to try and cut him off, which then effectively means he's got to turn on his heels and go back to where he started in Namsos. Otherwise, his force will be completely surrounded. So whilst Keyes is arguing with the Admiralty that they should be taking Trondheim, this all happens towards the end of April. And I've put the quote here from Keyes, which he writes to Churchill prophetically on the 28th of April. If this scuttle is persisted in, then the whole government will have to go, and I will do my damnedest to speed them. And that is a prophecy of what is about to happen. And what is about to happen is, I think, the most consequential debate that has ever taken place in the British House of Commons, which is the Norway debate that takes place on the 7th and 8th of May 1940. And this debate, I think, is so consequential. It takes place on what's called a motion for the adjournment of the House. And the reason for the debate is that Chamberlain has actually issued a public pronouncement that he thinks that Hitler has missed the bus in Norway, and that the British have actually, secured a strategic advantage because they're going to try and take Norway, which will interdict the German supply of iron ore, which is transshipped from Narvik. But unfortunately, as we've seen in the previous slide, the Germans get there first, and they take Oslo, they take Narvik, and they contest Narvik and they take Trondheim. So by the 7th and 8th of May 1940, it's looking very much like the naval port of Trondheim is not going to fall to the British, that Narvik is very much being contested. And, it looks like the Norway campaign is going to be a complete, British reversal. And that far from joking about missing the bus, Hitler's caught the bus, and it's Chamberlain who's missed the bus. And this prompts Roger Keyes to do something really quite dramatic. He decides, after talking with Duff Cooper, who had been in the government and had resigned over the Munich Treaty, and he talks to Harold Macmillan, and he decides to go to the House of Commons dressed in his uniform as an admiral of the fleet. So you can see here in the top left-hand corner the picture of what Keyes must have looked like when he turned up to the debate on Norway. And he speaks very early in the debate at 7:09. So he's one of the first speakers after the front benches have started the debate. And he bases his speech on what he has learned from General Carton de Wyatt, who has that very morning just come back to Britain from Norway. And Keyes goes to see him at his house in London, and he learns firsthand the story that I've just told you about Carton de Wyatt being told that he's to take Trondheim, the Navy will be there, not being told that the Navy has decided not to go to Trondheim, and then finding the Germans in possession of Trondheim and landing troops behind him. And Keyes tells that story to the House of Commons. And of course, back then, without mobile phones and all the modern communication that we have today, nobody knows this until Roger Keyes tells an astonished House of Commons just what's happened. And he starts his speech off by saying, "I wish to speak for the men and officers of the Royal Navy who are very unhappy." And he tells this absolute tale of complete British reversal, which really sets the tone for what then happens in the Norway debate. And speaker after speaker who follow Keyes, refer to his speech. And if you can imagine the visual reckoning and a scene in the House of Commons when you have an officer who is the hero of the First World War, who has more decorations than anybody else for gallantry, not just from his own country, but from countries of the world. He has the Legion d'Honneur from France. He has the US Congressional Medal of Honor. He has been honored for his bravery at Zeebrugge everywhere. And if you have a member of parliament with that track record getting up in his uniform and telling this story, the effect of this on the government benches is electrifying. And when he sits down from making his speech, in which he invokes the spirit of Nelson, the whole House of Commons erupts in spontaneous applause. Now, this is not something that is established parliamentary behaviour at all. It's deprecated in Parliament to burst into applause, but the whole House of Commons bursts into applause. And I've put in here the quote from the Soviet ambassador to London, Maisky, who is sitting up in the gallery of the House of Commons watching this debate. And he says, Keyes's words have the effect of shells fired from 16-inch guns. Because at that point, he basically destroys the coherence of the Chamberlain-led government in the House of Commons. And when the debate concludes on the 8th of May and the division bell rings, Keyes is reputed to have said, when he gets up from his seat, "They wouldn't let me lead the expedition to Trondheim, so I'm leading an expedition into the no lobby instead." And 42 government MPs follow him into the lobby. And the result is the Chamberlain government's majority is slashed from what should have been nearly 200 down to 80 MPs. And cries of resign fill the chamber, and it sets the tone in which Chamberlain's survival as Prime Minister is now not feasible. And in the wake of that, 2 days later, Prime Minister Churchill emerges as the choice of the Conservative Party in the famous meeting and the contest with Halifax. So that's the Norway debate. Keyes' instrumental role in the Norway debate actually sort of foretells not just a change in Britain's war, but a change in his fortunes. And literally on the 10th of May, Churchill dispatches him in one of his first acts as Prime Minister to Belgium to be the official British government liaison to King Leopold of the Belgians. And, you know, this is because Keyes has got a very strong relationship with the Belgians post the Zeebrugge and Ostend raids. He knows King Leopold's father, who died in 1932. He's known King Leopold since he was a small boy. Leopold has reached out to Keyes the minute the Second World War began as an unofficial back channel. Churchill makes Keyes the official channel, and he dispatches him to go to Leopold as the British government liaison. He arrives up in Brussels. He finds the British ambassador packing up the embassy and about to come back to Britain. A wonderful chap who rejoices in the name of Sir Lancelot Oliphant. And Keyes tells Oliphant there is no way he's allowing the British ambassador to leave his post. He's to remain in post, absolutely. And, you know, that is the job of the ambassador in these difficult times. And he acts as liaison between Leopold and Churchill. He tries to get additional air defenses deployed to Belgium. He gets the RAF to come and help stop the Germans bombing the Belgian army. He acts as liaison to Lord Gort, who's in charge of the British Expeditionary Force. And what then happens is the British decide, because of the Ardennes offensive and the danger of encirclement, to withdraw their armies from being in support of the Belgians and the French down to the port of Dunkirk. And this places Leopold and his armies in an impossible position. And as a result of which, Keyes is instructed to try and ensure that Leopold returns with him to Britain if Belgium can no longer remain in the war. Leopold feels that that is a dishonourable outcome, and he wishes to suffer the same fate as his countrymen. And so he remains and gets his army to remain in the field until the British army has successfully evacuated to the port of Dunkirk. And then he surrenders. Keyes takes his leave of Leopold and gets to the port of Newport, and literally with the Germans in hot pursuit with bullets flying, and he manages to get a British motor torpedo boat to take him back to the port of Harwich, and he gets off the next morning and goes straight to number 10 Downing Street to brief the cabinet on the Belgian surrender. And of course, the British and the French are incredibly unhappy about the fact that Belgium has surrendered, and the French in particular cry treason. And the British tabloid press pick this up, and they also say that Leopold has been a traitor to surrender. Keyes takes the view that he fought bravely until it was not possible to fight anymore, until his armies were literally on the point of destruction, and until the British had successfully evacuated to Dunkirk. And he takes on the British tabloid press and he issues writs for libel because they attack him as having been present with Leopold and call him a coward. And he takes the Daily Mirror to court, and he wins his libel action and gets undisclosed damages, and acts as the person who wishes to rehabilitate Leopold's reputation, which he does until his dying breath. So, having come back from his Belgium mission, when literally he's in the thick of the action, Churchill recalls him and appoints him as the first director of combined operations on the 17th of July 1940. And in this role, he is to make aggressive war on enemy-held coastline in France and in the occupied territories. And he will do this by taking charge of these irregular divisions and groups that have been used in Norway, and which he then forms as what we know today as the Commandos. So Roger Keyes is the founding head of the British Commandos in World War II, and his own son joins the Commandos, and he establishes their training up in Scotland in a place called Inverary, and he establishes a number of interesting new capabilities that the Commandos will have. I've put one here on the slides, which is he meets a chap called Roger Courtney, who's got this idea for full-butt canoes. So Keyes gives that the go-ahead. And many of you will know that later on in the war in 1942, we have Operation Frankton, which becomes known as the Cockleshell Raid on the Gironde estuary and the Cockleshell Heroes, which are done by the Commandos under Keyes. Well, Keyes has gone by then, but was an idea that took shape during Keyes's head of the combined operations. There are a number of raids that he wishes to conduct which are not given the go-ahead. And then there's one that is, which is a failure, which is to try and take some waterways in Italy. But probably the raid that came up in your podcast last week, Eddie and Joe, on the 3rd of March 1941 is Operation Claymore, which is the raid on the Lofoten Islands. And that really, I think, legitimizes what commando raids are all about. And in this raid, 600 commandos and 5 destroyers and 2 Dutch raiding craft managed to sink 20,000 tons of enemy shipping. They destroy 800,000 tons of fish oil, which is used in the manufacture of nitroglycerin for high explosives. And they destroy 18 factories. They get hold of 315 volunteers from Norway who want to come back and fight. And they also take 215 German prisoners and 16 Norwegian collaborators, as well as seizing an Enigma code wheel, which is sent to Bletchley Park. And the losses that they sustain for that level of success is 1 wounded officer. So the raid on the Lofoten Islands is a huge success and really shows what the commandos are capable of doing. And sadly for Keyes, it won't be him who will see all of the successes that then follow, but it is Keyes who I think we forget about, who sets up and has the idea of doing this. And unfortunately, because he's at this point, he's 68 to 69 years old, he's one of Winston's, friends, and he has an irritating habit of every time he disagrees with the chiefs of staff with whom he has to work very closely, he goes to Winston Churchill and tries to overrule them. Well, this sort of behavior is bound to get you to become very unpopular with your colleagues. And of course, most of the chiefs of staff, and particularly the naval ones, people like Dudley Pound, they'd all worked under Keyes. And, they all greatly admire Roger Keyes, but they felt he was past his sell-by date. They were, very keen to get rid of him, or at least to have his role downgraded. So what they proposed to Churchill is that he will become an advisor on combined operations, but he will not have the authority to conduct raids himself. And as far as Keyes is concerned, that is to emasculate him. And so, as what Lord Lovat calls a shower of sparks, he actually resigns in October 1941. And so that marks the end of his period. I would say, he makes a very valuable contribution. He sets it all up. He orders the landing craft that will then play a role later on. He's a great advocate for amphibious war, and he's the first commander of the Commandos, which, I think, is a great contribution. And his place is taken by somebody who'd also served under him during his time in the Mediterranean in the 1920s, which is Lord Louis Mountbatten. So that brings us on to the tragic story of his son. So his son, Geoffrey, who's his eldest boy, born in 1917, has actually been part of the irregular group that becomes the Commandos, and he's joined the Royal Scots Grey, and he then becomes a member of the Commandos, and he fights in the desert in the battle in in the Litani River campaign and is awarded the Military Cross. Towards the end of 1941, he has an idea with Laycock to see if they can assassinate Rommel. And they believe that Rommel spends a lot of time at a place called Beda Latoria, which is 200 miles behind the front lines. And Geoffrey Keyes puts his hand up to lead a raid to go and assassinate Rommel at Beda Latoria. And he's dispatched by submarine, and it leads a small group of commandos. Sadly, when they get there, Rommel isn't there when they launch the raid. And on the 18th of November 1941, Geoffrey Keyes goes in first, and he's killed leading the raid. 3 German officers and another German are killed, and they're quite senior officers. And Keyes is given a military funeral. Rommel sends his padre to personally lead the ceremony, and he insists that Keyes is given full military honours in his funeral. And back in the UK, he is put forward by Laycock for the Victoria Cross and awarded it posthumously. But it's a tragic story of a young man who was the absolute sort of in his family was the pride and joy of his father and mother, and who desperately wanted to if you like, be like his father, and is tragically killed as a result. So Keyes himself goes back to his role as being a member of Parliament. He's very active in the House of Commons. He speaks in a number of quite important debates. So he speaks in the debate over the Channel Dash. He asks lots of questions about what's happened to Force Z and why the Prince of Wales and Repulse were not given adequate protection. He's critical of the Royal Navy's performance during the Channel Dash in 1942. He's invited by Richmond and the historian G.M. Trevelyan to give the very prestigious Lee Knowles lectures in 1943 at Trinity College, Cambridge, and he uses that to talk and to deliver a lecture series about amphibious warfare, which has become his special cause. As someone who had led the British forces as the head of the naval staff at the Dardanelles, and as someone who set up, the raiding capability during his time at combined operations, he has a great deal of experience in amphibious warfare, and he sees it as really one of the key methods of waging war that will enable Britain and her allies to win, particularly for the Americans, who have the task of trying to take back the islands that have been taken by the Japanese. And that leads in 1944 to Keyes being sort of brought out of retirement, and after his slightly sort of combustible exit from combined operations in October 41, by 1944, both Churchill and his Minister for Information, Brendan Bracken, think that they can make use of Roger Keyes's reputation by sending him on a goodwill mission around Britain's Commonwealth allies to basically fly the flag and to engender good relationships in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. And as a result of that, he goes off in the summer of 1944 to lead this goodwill mission, and he goes via the United States. No sooner has he arrived on the quayside in New York in the United States, but his old friend Bernie Baruch, who's one of President Roosevelt's sort of special envoys, is literally waiting for him at the quayside. And he says, President Roosevelt said, you cannot pass through this country without coming to see him at the White House. So I think that really gives you an impression of just how important this man was perceived to be, that the President of the United States in the middle of a war sends someone to literally go and collect him the minute he sets foot in the United States and bring him to the White House. Because, Keyes's reputation is enormous as a military hero. And if he's going to be passing through the US, the president would like to see him. And the president introduces him to Admiral Ernie King, the head of the US Navy. And King says to him, well, while you're doing your goodwill tour, we've got some interesting operations that we are planning. which are really the invasion of the Philippines. And we'd be hugely honored if you'd come down and spend some time with the naval forces prior to their disembarkation for the action. And in fact, we'd like to introduce you to this chap, Chester Nimitz, and this other bloke, Douglas MacArthur. And they've already said to me, would you be interested in coming along for the ride? Well, of course, Keyes cannot resist this. This, and he's very struck by what he sees, because all of his visions for the importance of amphibious warfare are all basically perfectly laid out in front of him on an enormous scale by the US Navy preparing to invade the Philippine Islands. And so therefore Keyes goes along, he interrupts his goodwill tour, he goes along to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and he asks to go in one of the forward ships, the Appalachian. The Battle of Leyte Gulf is the first battle in which the Japanese use a kamikaze attacks. And the cruiser next to him, next to where his ship is, the Australia, is hit by a kamikaze plane. And the entire bridge is destroyed, and the captain and the senior officer of the ship are all killed. So that is how close Keyes is to the action, aged 72. And what they do during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and it's standard procedure for any naval ship under attack, is they lay smoke so that it's difficult to see the vessel from the air. And the US Navy has just introduced a new type of smoke, and it's highly carcinogenic. And for a young naval rating, aged in their sort of late teens, early 20s, it's going to give you a very bad cough and make you feel terrible. But for an elderly man of 72, it's going to be very debilitating indeed. And it lays Keyes out cold, and he has to be evacuated out of the battle area. He struggles on with his goodwill tour because he feels he must continue to raise the flag and engender good relations. So he struggles on manfully, but he is not a well man. And he comes back to Britain in March 1945 in a very, very weakened condition. And he struggles on for 6 months, but he finally succumbs and dies on Boxing Day in 1945 at his home in Buckinghamshire. And he's given a state funeral at Westminster Abbey before being laid to rest at Dover with his men who had died serving with him at Zeebrugge in 1918. His wife wanted him to be laid to rest in the Nelson crypt. Interestingly, from my doctoral research, there was a huge government effort to stop that happening, and they do stop that happening on the grounds that he never led a British fleet in battle. But the real reason is there's still a lot of people in the House of Commons who don't like him, and there's still a lot of people in the Navy who resented him. And the combination of those two factors means that he's laid to rest in Dover alongside his men. However, Churchill intervenes at this point, and he demands that a memorial plaque to Keyes be put in the Nelson crypt. And that is unveiled by Churchill in April 1950. And the plaque is to both Keyes and his son, Geoffrey, who both died as a result of injuries that they sustained during the war. And perhaps I think his best epitaph, he's often compared to Nelson. He was compared to Nelson by Churchill on several occasions, by Lloyd George, by General Sir Ian Hamilton at the Dardanelles, and by the British popular press. But I think the most fitting tribute actually comes from Admiral Andrew Cunningham, Viscount Cunningham, who said this of him: a great fighting leader and fearing nothing, he had the outstanding qualities as a leader. Above all, that asset which counts so much in war, the burning desire to get at the enemy at all times and by any means. And so I think when we look at Roger Keyes and we look at him in the Second World War, I think we see an admiral who was a leading exponent of amphibious war before his time, someone who established the raiding capability and the esprit de corps of the commandos, somebody I would argue that I would see as not the creator of British Special Forces, but the godfather of British Special Forces, the spiritual godfather. Lieutenant Colonel David Stirling, Lieutenant Colonel Roger Courtney, these were Keyes's men. And he wrote in a copy of one of his books that he gave to Brigadier Hayden of the Commandos when he left, "He most prevails who nobly dares." And we all know that the motto of the SAS is "Who dares win." So I think you can see how close Keyes's kind of warfare was to the spirit that the SAS and the SBS were founded on. He's someone who called out the dangers of appeasement right from the very beginning and stood with Churchill when others would not do so. And he is the man above all who I think led the political assassination of the Chamberlain government, which gave Churchill the opportunity to become Britain's Prime Minister in May 1940. And he was a believer in offensive warfare until his dying day. How many 72-year-olds do you know would go and place themselves in the middle of a battle next to a ship that is blown up by kamikaze pilots? That, I really think, shows you the sort of Admiral Roger Keyes was. He was, of course, incredibly irritating and upset a lot of people. But in the straitened circumstances that Britain found herself in, both in 1918 and in 1940, Roger Keyes, became the symbol of Britain's willingness to fight on against the odds. And I would close with this, Eddie and Joe, which is to say that in these difficult times we find ourselves in today, when we face threats from around the world and our traditional alliances may not be as solid as they once were, one has to ask the question, where are the people like Roger Keyes today? Thank you.
Oh, absolutely astonishing, Michael. Really brilliant. Incredibly enjoyable. I mean, it was like watching a really powerful documentary, even a feature film. Just imagining the young Keyes with the Union Jack in his teeth, climbing up the ladder in Beijing, and then the raids in Ostend and the Zeebrugge, and then the Second World War, the tragedy of his son. What an astonishing story, in the political career as well. I really, there's so much in there, and you've chosen this topic well, Michael. And I'm sure there's no problem at all about your Viva next week, or and the next time we talk, you're going to be Dr. Michael Keegan, and you're going to be speaking at our conference and the International Second World War History Network conference in May.
Yes, absolutely, Eddie. And if I could just give a quick plug, I've also after the doctorate, will be publishing Keyes's biography over the summer. The first biography of Roger Keyes, the first serious one for 70 years.
Okay, Joe, look, I know you've got to go in 5 minutes, so go ahead. You got any questions or comments to make?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to make the observation. So, so this is to do with, obviously, I'd like to discuss a little bit more about the Lofoten raid, given its enormous success, and also highlighting the fact that, the Norwegian fish oil was a surprisingly important resource during the Second World War. And if there's any number of strategic reasons why you seize Norway, you seize it because of it's got plenty of hydroelectric power. This was something that was considered to be very important in terms of heavy water production. That's why they chose Norway as the ideal site in order to do it. It was ideal for as a U-boat base, and also it had access to iron ore supplies that were vital to the German war effort coming out of Sweden. That's the key reason why you go there. But a lot of people overlook the fish oil, which they still produce in Norway in abundance, as a vital war ingredient for the production of explosive. And actually, I believe it's also a very, I think there's a derivative of fish oil that they also use in I think it's engine fluid, basically, for aircraft aviation. I think it's the equivalent of engine oil for aircraft as well. But the thing that really caught my attention was Roger Keyes' son. It was Geoffrey Keyes, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
So there is a connection here. 11 Commando was Geoffrey Keyes' commando unit, and he succeeded the commanding officer of that unit upon his death in combat. I can't remember his name, of course, but the commanding officer of 11 Commando was killed in battle at the Litani River.
That's correct.
Fighting against the Vichy French and the Vichy French forces that were then in Lebanon. And so one of the men in 11 Commando, one of the officers in 11 Commando, was none other than Paddy Mayne, and also
That's correct.
Owen McGonigal as well, who are founding members of the SAS. And not only that, but Paddy Mayne was, when he was recruited into the SAS, was on a charge at the time. He was under arrest and on a charge for assaulting not one but two superior officers, among whom was Geoffrey Keyes. So this is all preceding Geoffrey Keyes' involvement in the raid on Rommel's headquarters, is the fact that he is effectively a comrade of Paddy Mayne, who is a founder of the SS. So he's got a direct connection to the SS. As another tangent. Yeah.
He has. I would add, Joe, that Paddy Mayne didn't like him. So
no, there was no love lost there.
There was no love lost, because Paddy Mayne regarded him as, who's this precious guy who's the son of Admiral Keyes? Get him out of here. So, the truth, I think, is they were both incredibly brave people. And, I think poor old Geoffrey couldn't really help the fact of whose son he was. But I think, I think there was a fight between the two of them on one occasion. Yes. So I think, Paddy Mayne was, has got his own fantastic reputation. But, Geoffrey Keyes paid for his bravery with his life, and and was honoured for that.
Okay, Joe, is there anything else before you set off for London?
Not a huge amount, except to say that was a fantastic and very stimulating talk, Michael, and really. So I have to say, yes, best of luck in your Viva, and look forward to the release of the biography of Admiral Roger Keyes. I think it'll be, if your talk is anything to go by, it should be a riveting read.
Yep.
Thank you,
Joe. Well, I'll see you again soon.
I'll be in touch. Okay.
Sure. Thanks very much. See you.
So I noticed from the comments, Eddie, someone asked about Lovett and Keyes. Well, they were great
get the
friends.
background on Lovett. Lovett, who is the
So Lovett is one of the senior commandos. Simon Lovett, Simon Fraser, Lord Lovett, and he's a senior commando officer. He fights with great distinction, on the Lofoten raid. He goes on to lead the commando operations in Dieppe, and he also leads the commando operations in D-Day, and the relief of the chaps on, is it the Orme Bridge? He's a fighter of great distinction. He's also a member of the House of Lords, and if you read his biography, March Past, he adores Roger Keyes.
Okay, so that's the question.
He is a massive fan of Roger Keyes, and when Keyes is ennobled and becomes a member of the House of Lords on the 1st of January 1943, it is Lord Lovett who introduces him to the House.
Right. Okay. Well, that's a decisive answer there. I noticed Darren Little. Very pleased you're watching again, Darren. He said his grandfather was in Norway with No. 2 Independent Company. I don't know what.
Right. So the independent companies became the commandos. So grandfather was obviously in the early version of the commandos. So
and he was wounded at Bodo, which I assume is in Norway, and wounded, taken to hospital, evacuated. And his Darren also said he volunteered for the commandos after he recovered.
Yeah.
He was the number one army commander from its inception.
Yeah.
So, Darren, thanks very much for pitching in there with your own stories. Isn't it amazing the way that these personal stories connect with the research that Michael's doing? And suddenly all these extraordinary links. It makes you feel closer to the people, doesn't it, when you've got a family connection? And Paddy Mayne, who didn't he punch? That's the question I would ask. Great. So the politics of that period before the Second World War, vital period. So I mean, in April, I mean May, when the speech was made, and of course you can imagine the speech was being made just before the Germans started invading the Low Countries. I mean, it was just more or less coincided. The politics of the situation is the majority of the Conservative Party were basically pro-Chamberlain at that point.
Yes, massively, enormously. I mean, if you were to measure it, the number, the people who were against Chamberlain were called the diehards. And, there were literally very, very few of them, handfuls.
Do you know why the Keyes had such a particularly outspoken and very confirmed view about what was going on? Is there any explanation why he formed that view while so many other people he kept I mean, I think Keyes was a believer in British naval supremacy, right?
So policies which were put in place under the appeasement regime, like the London Naval Treaty of 1930, which was the forerunner. Appeasement comes along as a policy in the mid-1930s, but then you get the Anglo-German Naval Treaty, and you get all of the other things that go along with appeasement, and the fact that you don't get the funding of the naval force, you don't get the funding for the RAF. All of these policies in sum create a nervousness amongst the military in Parliament. And here's what people forget, Eddie. When Keyes gets up to speak in the Norway debate, there's 237 MPs in that House of Commons who fought in the previous war.
237.
Yeah, so there's military service, and it was something that about half of the members of the House of Commons had directly done. Right, so there was a thing that brought them all together beyond the party differences, which was many of them had served together in the war.
But of course, that was a factor that influenced their attitude, wasn't it? Because they were so horrified and terrified of repetition. Yeah. Quite a lot of the MPs would have said, well, we don't like Hitler and we don't know what's going on, but we really can't go through what we did in the First World War. Do you think that was a factor at that point?
For certainly, it was that. But it was also, Keyes kept himself very well informed. He had a truly international network. Because being in the Royal Navy, he'd served all around the world, and so he knew the admirals, and he knew the French admirals, he knew the Italian admirals, he knew the Japanese admiral. He'd known Roosevelt from the First World War when he was secretary to the Navy. So he had a personal network that kept him very well informed about what was going on, and it looked to him that Hitler couldn't be trusted to keep his word. Right. And as I said, at the high point of appeasement, to vote against the Munich Treaty, to abstain on the Munich Treaty, this was something that was literally, in Churchill's case, because he abstained on the Munich Treaty, they tried to deselect him in his constituency of Wanstead and Woodford because he wouldn't support Munich. So now, funnily enough, they didn't try that with Keyes, because I don't think there would be anybody brave enough in the Conservative Party to go and take on Admiral Roger Keyes, because he had a reputation that was something that you wouldn't trifle with. And the Conservative chief whip at the time was a captain in the British Army in World War I, and there was no way he was going to be disciplining an admiral of the fleet.
Right.
But they did try it with Churchill. So he was very brave like that. Now, one of your correspondents here in the chat has said, Halifax wouldn't have been a fan of Keyes. No, he certainly wouldn't. And you're right to point out that there were plenty of people who didn't like him. And I think we should be, we shouldn't get too misty-eyed about Admiral Keyes, because he had a lot of people who didn't like him. And Churchill, he had a great relationship with Churchill, but Churchill and him fell out over a few things over the course of the war. Admiral Dudley Pound, when Keyes was in the ascendancy in the 1920s, Admiral Dudley Pound was his biggest supporter. But when Keyes is passed over in 1930 and retires in 1931, Pound becomes the second Sea Lord and then the first Sea Lord during the first part of the Second World War. And the last person he wants back in command position is Roger Keyes. Yeah. So Pound moves from being a huge supporter into being a huge opponent. John Colville, who's Churchill's private secretary at 10 Downing Street, if you read his diaries, he cannot stand Keyes. He thinks he's vain, he thinks he's self-important, he thinks he's belligerent, and and the truth is, Eddie, he's all of those things.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to think of someone in contemporary politics that you might say
he's a Marmite character. Yeah, he's a Marmite.
Well, people don't like him, but is there anybody in contemporary British politics you say, well, he's a bit like? Do you have that feeling, or he reminds?
Yes, I don't want to sort of I don't want to sort of label him incorrectly, but there's no one I can think of who's quite like him in contemporary politics because of the military angle. Because he's such a hero. He's the hero of the nation.
Yes.
But the fact that the Labour MPs, Liberal MPs, as well as Conservatives, will rally to his side over the Norway debate, because they know that he's not a partisan politician. He's not a party hack. He is the military in Parliament. He is the Royal Navy in Parliament. And the Royal Navy is the capability on which Britain's position in the world depends. And if Keyes thinks the government's got it wrong, then the House of Commons takes the view, this guy knows what he's talking about. If he thinks we've got it wrong, we're definitely going to have to change the Prime Minister.
Yeah, fascinating. I can't imagine anything like that happening again in the House of Commons. I just can't imagine the debate even would be allowed, let alone, because someone like Keyes, who has so much personal status, the whips couldn't really control him.
No, he was uncontrollable. He was uncontrollable. And I think our politics is better for people who are like this. We may not agree with them, and we may find them quite difficult to deal with, but he was prepared to say the quiet bit out loud. He was prepared to say what no one else would, which was, Munich is a disaster. We are selling out Czechoslovakia. Germany is rearming. The Japanese will come for us and our colonies and our empire in the Asia-Pacific theatre. You cannot trust these people. The government is not doing the right thing. This was a very unpopular set of messages, and the penny doesn't really drop until March 1939. And in March 1939, when the bits of Czechoslovakia are invaded that were specifically left to be free under the Munich Treaty, that is when the penny drops. And
Interesting change in the public mood, I think.
And that's when the public mood then changes. And then
the House of Commons introduces effectively conscription in March 1939. It was that Militia Training Act, as it was called. It wasn't called conscription.
He's been calling for it for years before then.
The Militia Training Act, which actually I think provided for all men aged 19 to be given 6 months militia training, like the Territorial Army. That's what vectored my father into the army, from working in a tailoring shop in London, and that's what picked him up, because it was 20-year-olds, and he was exactly 20 in 1939, perfect material.
And he got conscripted.
He was under the Militia Training Act, which actually I think initially involved him. It called, because there was no war. I think once war was declared, the Militia Training Act, I think there was something about the conditions of being in the Territorial Army, that you could then be assigned overseas. But anyway, thank you, Michael. What a wonderful story. I really wish you every success. Not you, best luck. I don't think you need it. I think the book is going to be outstanding. I can just see, surely, someone in our great broadcasting firmament is going to be prepared to convert this story either into a really compelling documentary or even a docudrama, because I think to try and capture these moments, and that moment, that's pure theatre. Standing up in the House of Commons in his naval uniform, looking like he's
of an Admiral of the Fleet, with his ceremonial sword and every honour that not just Britain but everybody else can give you.
Standing up, could you imagine? We talked about a show-stopping performance, and changed the course of British political history, and whether he changed the course of the war, but certainly, and then 2 days later, Winston Churchill is Prime Minister, and suddenly our story is radically altered. Michael, what an astonishing story. Now, I'm just going to put you in the green room for a moment, but don't leave it, because I just want to close the show down and we can talk afterwards. So that was a brilliant story. I'm so pleased that Michael was able to come and share in such a compelling way this incredible story about an extraordinary man from this important part of British and world history. So thank you to Michael. Thank you to everybody who watched the show. Tell your friends about it, because I think it's well worth watching. And when Michael's book comes out later this year, I'm sure you'll be queuing up to buy a copy. I'm sure Michael will be doing some signing ceremonies. But if you want to meet him, your opportunity is coming, because he will be speaking at the International Second World War History Network Conference, which is being held in London Scottish House, only 10 minutes walk from Victoria Station, just round the corner from the House of Commons. And he will be speaking about this topic at the conference at the London Scottish House on Saturday, the 9th of May. We still have some space left. The admission is free for those who wish to book, and if you go to Eventbrite, you can see how you can do that. So I think that's it for today. And so from everybody here at This Week in the Second World War, it's goodbye, good luck, and may God bless you all.